On tonight's summary of the Israel-Hamas War, Day 168. The hostage negotiations summit is underway in Qatar. The Israeli delegation had its mandate for negotiations expanded in the past 24 hours. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reports that the death toll in Gaza, including fighters and civilians, crosses 32,000. The IDF operation in Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City continues. This is the 5th day of the raid. The second Friday of Ramadan passes peacefully in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Reports vary between 50,000 and 120,000 worshippers in the mosque, including 10,000 Palestinians from the West Bank. U.S. Secretary of State concludes his visit in Israel by stating that an invasion of Rafah would endanger both Palestinian civilians as well as Israel's security. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu states that if Israel has to, it will do it alone. Hello everyone, I am Alon Burstein, visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Israel Institute Fellow at the University of California, Irvine. Here I bring you the summary of the last 24 hours of the Israel-Hamas War. It's currently the evening of March 22nd, 2024 in the United States, the morning of March 23rd, 2024 in the Middle East. Starting with the hostage situation, the negotiators' summit in Qatar is underway. The talks include the head of the Mossad, Dedi Barnea, CIA Director William Barnes, Egyptian head of intelligence Abbas Kamel, and Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed Athani. Joining the Israeli team in this round were also the head of the Israeli Shabak, Ronen Bar, and General Nitzan Alon of the IDF. According to reports, shortly before the departure of the Israeli team, the Israeli War Cabinet voted to expand the negotiations mandate, and after the head of the Shabak and General Nitzan Alon told the War Cabinet that if the mandate is not expanded, negotiations cannot move forward. It was not reported how long the summit will be. In previous rounds, some of these summits lasted several days. In the last round, the summit lasted only 24 hours. If the mandate for the Israeli negotiating team has been expanded, that means that that team can give more concessions to Hamas demands, which may lead to the long-anticipated breakthrough. It may not. It remains to be seen in the coming days. Other news, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Israel today. After his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, he stated that the focus of the talks was the hostage negotiations and the efforts to secure a 6-week truce, which, according to him, will allow the release of hostages and the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. In addition to this, the family members of 81 hostages wrote an open letter to U.S. President Biden today and to Vice President Kamala Harris, expressing concern and frustration with the, quote, lack of continuous commitment of Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel's War Cabinet to the quickest way to release the hostages. The families openly asked the U.S. administration to, again, quote, help guide the Israeli Prime Minister to work in the right direction. Moving on to the Gaza Strip, there was one barrage of rockets fired from the Gaza Strip towards Kibbutz Be'eri in Israel in the last 24 hours. It was reportedly intercepted. Regarding the fighting in the Gaza Strip, in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, the IDF operation in Al-Shifa Hospital continues. This is now day 5 of this operation. It was reported throughout the day that fighting continued in different compounds of Al-Shifa, and that the IDF is continuing to go through different buildings and wards. Al Jazeera quoted eyewitnesses stating that the IDF has called on all people in Al-Shifa to surrender themselves to the forces as they approach. Videos also emerged from areas around the hospital, showing IDF bulldozers and engineering units clearing areas adjacent to the hospital compounds, and in some cases erecting barriers in and around the compound. In addition to this, it was reported that several more arrests were carried out throughout the day. However, the IDF did not give any names of any high-profile people who were arrested. In addition to this, relating to the arrests that were published yesterday, in the array of pictures that the IDF published, some people noticed that there was a photo of Raed Salah, who is the head of operations in the Hamas movement and one of the most senior figures planning the military operations of Al-Qassam. This started a string of rumors, as the IDF spokesperson had also stated yesterday that very senior people had been arrested. Some people suggested that the IDF had managed to arrest him, but had not reported upon this. Other people also suggested that possibly this was part of the IDF psychological warfare vis-a-vis Hamas, trying to show that maybe he was arrested. Today, the IDF and the Shabak both put out messages stating that neither of those things are true, that in fact this was a mistake. Salah has not been captured, and the picture was added as a result of human error. However, it was suggested in some of the reports that there is a belief in the IDF that Raed Salah is still hiding somewhere in Shifa, and that he is going to be arrested in the coming days. In addition to this, in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, alongside the Operation Al-Shifa, there was reportedly intensive battles throughout the Al-Rimal neighborhood of Gaza City. The Al-Rimal is one of the neighborhoods that, in addition to Al-Shifa, the IDF called upon Palestinian civilians to evacuate from in the last week, so likely the IDF is planning an intensifying and expanding operation in that region. In the central parts of the Gaza Strip, bombings were reported in the al-Isra region of al-Nuseirat refugee camp today, targeting a house in the region. 9 Palestinians were reported killed, others were also reported injured. The IDF did not report who the target of this bombing was. In the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, in Khan Yunis, there is still intensive fighting in different parts of the city. 2 structures in which tunnel entrances were located were detonated and destroyed. It was not reported specifically where. Likely this is in the areas of Hamid City. Gun battles were also reported throughout different areas, both in the western parts and eastern parts of the city. Mortars were also fired at IDF troops in one encounter, and tank units were also involved in that battle. Intensive bombing was reported in the Nasser neighborhood in Khan Yunis as well. In addition to this, in Rafah, there were several rounds of bombings that were reported in different areas, primarily in the northern and eastern parts of the city. Again, these were all reported by local sources on the ground. The IDF did not make any specific statements about what was being targeted in Rafah. Other news related to the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, a video footage was circulated showing several seemingly unarmed Palestinians who were walking an area of Khan Yunis before they were targeted in several different airstrikes. The video continues to show that each time one of the Palestinians manages to get up, another airstrike manages to target them, and they are eventually all killed. The IDF put out a statement today stating that the video appears to be from an area in Khan Yunis that has been evacuated from civilians, and there's been a lot of intensive fighting in that region. However, the military is investigating if in fact these Palestinians were unarmed and if these airstrikes were approved. I remind everyone that this comes amidst the famous case within the IDF in which unarmed civilians were fired upon, which ended up being 3 Israeli hostages that had managed to escape and were waving a white flag and had their hands up, and they were fired upon nonetheless. According to the IDF, since that incident, a lot of the regulations have been clarified to soldiers on the ground, specifically also with regards to airstrikes. Airstrikes are supposed to be approved by higher levels within the IDF. This is reportedly being investigated. Regarding casualties, no IDF soldiers reported killed in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours. The total number of IDF soldiers killed in the Gaza Strip since the invasion began remains 251. 8 IDF soldiers reported injured in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours. This brings the total number of IDF soldiers injured in the Gaza Strip since the invasion began to 1,497. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reports 82 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours, which brings the total number of Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began to over 32,000. It is now 32,070. 74,298 Palestinians reported injured in the Gaza Strip since the war began, and there are still several thousand Palestinians that are reportedly buried under the rubble and presumed dead. According to the numbers that the IDF has published, the IDF estimates that some 13,000 Palestinians who are Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters or simply armed fighters have been killed since the war began, and also some 12,000 have been injured. The IDF has not put out numbers about what is the total number of Palestinians that it estimates have been killed since the war began, but if we combine those two numbers, that would be roughly 13,000, or by now possibly a little higher, out of the 32,000. Moving on to the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, the UN published a report today stating that some 13% of internally displaced women in Rafah lack any documentation for both them and their family members, which hinders their ability to get aid and essential services. The report also cites different agencies that found that 30 to 40% of internally displaced Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have lost their documentation during displacement. This creates a lot of problems with the bureaucracy, since different aid agencies sometimes require documentation to make sure that they are distributing aid, quote-unquote, fairly among different civilians and not giving to the same family more than one of the families not getting anything. So this report came out today. There was no report published today regarding aid paradropping missions that were carried out. However, I will add that likely they were still carried out. These missions are being carried out almost every day, and even when they're not reported, sometimes the following day there are reports that yesterday certain paradropping missions were carried out. We may hear more about this tomorrow. There are also no reports about the entrance of trucks in the last 24 hours, but once again, this does not necessarily mean that no trucks entered, but it does mean that at least not a significant enough amount was entered that any agency reported upon it. Moving on to the West Bank, there was a Palestinian attack that occurred near Ramallah. This was in the vicinity of the Dolev settlement and the Parsa junction. According to reports, the attacker, Mujahed Barkat Mansour, was armed with a sniper weapon that was fitted with optical lens as well, and had moved into a hilly area during the night and barricaded himself within bushes and in different hideouts, and at 5:15 in the morning began firing at Israeli targets along the road. Substantial IDF forces rushed to the scene and aerial units were involved as well. However, his positioning gave him a lot of cover, and he held up on the hill targeting different Israeli forces for over 5 hours until a helicopter unit managed to identify him and he was killed. 8 Israelis, most of these IDF soldiers that were involved in the search, were injured as a result of this attack. In addition, later in the day, 2 Palestinians were arrested in the Patza'el settlement. This is in the Jordan Valley. According to reports, they were armed with AK-47s. However, they were arrested without any resistance. Other news, at the end of the second Friday of Ramadan, there was continued calm in Jerusalem after the prayers in Al-Aqsa. The Waqf, which is the Islamic religious institution that manages Al-Aqsa, reported that 120,000 worshippers prayed in the compound. The Israeli police in turn stated that some 50,000 worshippers had entered the Al-Aqsa mosque and the entire compound. Over 10,000 Palestinians reportedly joined the prayers from the West Bank. In addition to this, there were reports of IDF activity throughout various different areas of the West Bank in the last 24 hours. However, there were no specific reports about confrontations that erupted, and no reports were disseminated about how many Palestinians were arrested. Moving on to the northern parts of Israel, southern parts of Lebanon. After the escalations of the last several weeks, in the last several days, I have said that there's been relative calm. Today, there was even more relative calm. Throughout the day, most of the attacks have been either drone attacks rather than rocket barrages, and the IDF retaliations have also been on a much lower level than they have in the past weeks. Regarding rockets and missiles, there was a barrage of rockets fired from Lebanon towards the areas of Metula. In addition to this, there were repeated drone attacks throughout the day in the western Galilee. Several drones were reportedly intercepted. In addition to this, there were several drone alerts that were reported in the upper Galilee in Israel as drones were launched from the areas of southern Lebanon. These targeted the areas of Rajar, Dafna, Goshrim, Kibbutz Dan, and Snir. At several of these incidents, 30 minutes after the alerts were sounded, the IDF reported that the incident was over. No reports were made if interceptions occurred or not in the upper Galilee. However, again, there were several interceptions of drones in the western Galilee. Regarding IDF activity, IDF warplanes reportedly attacked Hezbollah military structures in the areas of Ita Sha'ab. And in a second round of attack, 3 simultaneous attacks were carried out against Hezbollah structures in the areas of Ita Sha'ab, once again, Al-Hayam, and Ataybe. In addition to this, Lebanon announced today that it is going to file a complaint against Israel in the UN Security Council, reportedly for jamming signals that the IDF has been using to disrupt GPS activity in Lebanon. When the IDF carried out its invasion of Gaza, there was a lot of GPS jamming that was being reported that was also affecting the population in Israel. This is one of the first times that Lebanon is officially stating that its GPS is being jammed by the IDF. However, again, it is not uncommon when the IDF carries out these different attacks. Moving on to some of the political and general trends from the last 24 hours, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Israel, concluding his tour of the Middle East. This is his 8th trip to Israel since the war began, and 6th tour of the Middle East. He reportedly met with the war cabinet, as well as holding private meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Minister Gantz, and several other different officials. According to reports, his meeting with the war cabinet was very tense, and Blinken applied a lot of pressure on Israel to allow the return of Palestinian civilians to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, and to move forward with the hostage deal. This is one of the 2 main bones of contention between the sides in the hostage negotiations. Hamas is demanding complete freedom of movement of Palestinians to return to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, whereas Israel is stating that this will allow Hamas to completely rebuild its forces there. Israel is reportedly considering allowing the return of women and children. However, also that has not been agreed upon yet. Later, after Antony Blinken's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, he stated that a military invasion in Rafah would endanger the lives of civilians, as well as endanger Israel's security, as Israel is risking world ostracization if it carries out the invasion and becoming a pariah state. In turn, it was reported that during the war cabinet meeting, Israel's minister Ron Dermer, who's one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's closest allies, presented Israel's steadfast position on the necessity to invade Rafah. In addition to this, after the private meeting between Blinken and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu put out a video message in Hebrew with English subtitles. After stating that he discussed with Antony Blinken Israel's plans to evacuate civilians from fighting areas and maintaining the humanitarian needs of civilians in the Gaza Strip, he added that, I quote, "There is no way to defeat Hamas without entering Rafah and destroying the battalions there. I told him that I hope that we do this with the support of the United States, but if we have to, we will do it alone." Several hours later, seemingly answering Netanyahu, White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby stated that the U.S. has clarified to Israel several times its grave concerns regarding an invasion of Rafah, and that the United States believes that it will be disastrous. He added that we have not seen any credible plans for evacuating civilians from Rafah. I remind everyone that that has been something that the U.S. administration has been repeating, that it wants to see from Israel credible and viable plans for how this will be done in order for the U.S. to support this invasion. John Kirby also added that it will be a mistake if Israel invades Rafah, and that the U.S. plans on presenting to Israel alternatives for destroying Hamas without invading the city. In addition to this, Australia and the United Kingdom also used similar language today, stating that a ground invasion into Rafah could have disastrous consequences. Other political news: the United States put forth a UN Security Council resolution today calling for the immediate release of all hostages that are held in the Gaza Strip and for a ceasefire in the war. 11 countries voted in favor of the resolution, which was then vetoed by China and Russia, who both stated that the wording of the resolution does not require an immediate ceasefire and would allow Israel to invade Rafah. Hamas put out a statement thanking Russia and China for this, stating that, quote, "The resolution did not include an explicit demand for an immediate cessation of the Zionist aggression in Gaza." AFP reported that another resolution is going to be voted upon tomorrow in the UN Security Council, calling for an immediate ceasefire regardless of hostage release. Very likely this is going to be vetoed by the United States. The importance of the U.S. putting forth this resolution is less the fact that it was vetoed. This was expected. I already reported on this yesterday, that it was expected that either Russia or China, in this case both, vetoed it. But the fact that the U.S. put forth this resolution without Israel's consent is another level in the signaling between the Israeli government and the U.S. administration, with the U.S. administration showing that it is not approving of what Israel is doing in the war. It has been saying this to Israel. It has sent its emissaries to Israel. However, putting forth a resolution in the UN Security Council is taking it up a notch. Usually, the United States defends Israel in the Security Council from resolutions that would call upon Israel to stop fighting. In this case, the fact that the U.S. put forth its own resolution that theoretically, had it passed, would have compelled Israel to stop fighting is very significant when we evaluate the relationship between the countries. Other news: the U.S. Committee on Foreign Affairs in the U.S. Congress approved a resolution today calling upon the United States to reevaluate its relationship with South Africa in light of the case South Africa put forth against Israel in the International Court of Justice and the country's growing ties with Iran, Russia, and China. South Africa responded in turn that this move of the United States is an anti-democratic move. Other political news: a death threat was sent today to Israel's ambassador in Ireland, Dana Ehrlich. The package included white powder, which lab tests later showed was sugar. Inside the package, however, was a picture of the bodies of Israelis that were killed on October 7th, alongside Ehrlich's picture and the writing, "You are next." Moving on to the future of the Gaza Strip, an IDF battalion commander that is currently involved in the fighting in Khan Yunis spoke to reporters today and reportedly stated that the solution to the situation in the Gaza Strip, as far as he's concerned, is to establish Israeli settlements in the Strip as a way of getting back at Hamas. While he admitted that this is a political question and not up to the military, he was reprimanded by the military for making political statements about the future of the Gaza Strip while he is on duty. In addition to this, several statements were made by the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken today regarding the day-after plans and the need to come up with a concrete plan for the future of the Gaza Strip. Meeting with Israel's war cabinet, reportedly Israel's chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, gave Blinken detailed summaries of the war effort and answered Blinken's questions with regards to plans and continued fighting. However, when Blinken asked about day-after plans and what's going to be the future of the Gaza Strip, Prime Minister Netanyahu intervened and stated that without destroying Hamas, there will be no day after. Similar to his warnings about the invasion of Rafah, Blinken reportedly stated that without a day-after plan, nor a strategy for an alternative governing body in the Gaza Strip, Israel is going to lose world legitimacy and support for the war and is going to find itself stuck in Gaza. Before leaving Israel, Blinken again stated that also Israel is aware that destroying Hamas is contingent upon a diplomatic development and not just military strength, and stated that avoiding the subject is costing Israel legitimacy in the war. So again, what we're seeing is the escalating collision between Israel and the United States regarding the visions of both the need to invade Rafah and what that is going to achieve, how this is going to facilitate destroying Hamas, but more importantly, what is this serving? What is going to be the future of the Gaza Strip, and are there ends that the sides agree upon that can then justify different means? If you enjoy these reports, please do remember to give them a like, subscribe, turn on notifications if you want to know when reports come out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. That is my report for the last 24 hours. I'll be back tomorrow.